The Great War painted Europe in shades of mud and blood, a symphony of destruction where heroism was often measured in lives taken. But amidst the roar of cannons and the screams of the dying, another kind of courage flickered, often unarmed, frequently unsung, yet profoundly human. Therefore, we journey back to those trenches, not just to witness the conflict, but to uncover the extraordinary tales of compassion, sacrifice, and unexpected connections that blossomed in the very heart of darkness. These are the stories you thought you knew, and the ones you never imagined. From the Christmas truce where carols replaced cannons, to Sergeant York's profound battle of faith, the inspiring loyalty of Sergeant Stubby, the poignant love that fueled Hemingway's masterpiece, and the selfless courage of medics under fire. These are not just war stories, they are powerful testaments to the enduring human spirit. Which of these incredible moments touched you the most? If these tales of courage and compassion resonated with you, please smash that like button. It truly helps these histories reach more people, and be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past. Crucially, watch this video to the very end. Each story adds a vital piece to this incredible human puzzle, and your viewership greatly supports the channel. Now, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there for you? Also, please share which of these 5 stories, the Christmas truce, York, Stubby, Hemingway, or the medics, made the biggest impact on you and why. I read all your comments. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Story 1. The Melody Across No Man's Land. The Melody Across No Man's Land, a witness's account, December 1914. The Western Front was a desolate canvas painted in an unrelenting palette of cold and mud. 4 long months had bled away since the Great War erupted, and the hopeful, oft-repeated promise of soldiers being home by Christmas had dissolved into a bitter, distant mirage. The men, irrespective of the British, French, Belgian, or German uniforms they wore, had all become intimately, tragically acquainted with the brutal, soul-crushing realities of modern trench warfare. They were bone-weary, gnawed by hunger, and above all, consumed by an aching, visceral yearning for home. Night would descend like a suffocating shroud, bringing with it a silence stretched taut with unspoken dread, a silence only occasionally, violently, pierced by the crack of a lone rifle or the guttural, far-off rumble of artillery. Yet, on that singular, sacred Christmas Eve, something utterly extraordinary, almost ethereal, began to unfurl amidst the damp, squalid misery of the opposing trenches. From the German lines, a familiar melody, at first hesitant, almost a whisper, then gaining in emotional resonance and clarity, drifted across the scarred, barren expanse of no man's land. It was Still Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night. Initially, the British soldiers hunkered down in their trenches opposite were startled, their senses, honed by months of peril, instantly on high alert. Was this some new, insidious ruse? A cunningly orchestrated deception designed to lure them into a trap? Suspicion, a deeply ingrained reflex in that hostile theater of war, was their first, instinctive response. But the Christmas carol, imbued with an almost mystical, inherent power, possessed an ability to transcend all man-made barriers of hatred and fear. It resonated deep within the hidden recesses of the soldiers' souls, a poignant key unlocking floodgates of memory, images of family gathered around a warm hearth, the comforting embrace of home, the simple joys of Christmases past, now so achingly, impossibly distant. And then, as if in a spontaneous, uncoordinated yet perfectly timed harmonic response, another voice, clear and true, rose from the British trenches in reply. It was the First Noel, a carol equally laden with a profound sense of nostalgia and an unquenchable yearning for peace. The silence that enveloped the battlefield thereafter was subtly different. It was no longer as heavy, as pregnant with foreboding as before. It held, instead, a palpable sense of anticipation, a fragile flicker of nascent curiosity. Then, from the German trenches, a smattering of tentative applause could be heard, which gradually swelled in volume. The British side, moved by this unexpected gesture, responded in kind, their own volleys of clapping echoing across the frozen earth. Something intangible, an invisible, delicate thread of connection, seemed to be weaving itself between the two opposing lines, a fragile bridge across a chasm of animosity. It was not long before a lone figure, silhouetted against the dim light, slowly, cautiously emerged from a German trench. He carried no weapon. Instead, he held aloft a small, crudely fashioned branch, sparsely adorned with a few lit candle stubs, a poignant, makeshift Christmas tree. A call, spoken in heavily accented, broken English, drifted across the intervening space, a declaration, a plea that they would not fire if the British soldiers would reciprocate their peaceful intent. A fresh wave of tension momentarily rippled through the British lines. Orders for heightened vigilance, for readiness, were barked by NCOs, but the sight of those flickering, hopeful candle flames, and then the appearance of a few more German soldiers, also unarmed, their hands held open in a gesture of peace, began to erode the ingrained suspicion in some of the British troops. A strange, unbidden courage, or perhaps it was an overwhelming, desperate hunger for a single moment of respite from the relentless carnage, spurred them on. A voice, strong and clear, from the British side shouted back across the divide, an assurance that they, too, would hold their fire. And so, the unimaginable, the utterly improbable, began to happen. One by one at first, then in small, hesitant groups, soldiers from both sides started to clamber out of the relative and often illusory safety of their trenches. They moved with a cautious trepidation, venturing out into the forbidding, pockmarked expanse of no man's land, that deadly, barren strip of earth that lay, like a gaping wound, between the two entrenched armies. They met in the middle, these men who, mere hours before, had been peering at each other through rifle sights, their fingers on triggers. Initially, there was an understandable awkwardness, a mutual, silent sizing up. Then, hands were extended, tentatively at first, then with a growing firmness, a surprising warmth. Christmas greetings, in a faltering, sometimes comical, mixture of English, German, and French, were exchanged. The formidable barrier of language seemed to recede, to become almost irrelevant, when smiles of genuine goodwill and eyes reflecting a shared, unspoken understanding met across the cultural divide. This impromptu, almost surreal, meeting swiftly transformed into an extraordinary, spontaneous social gathering. Small, treasured gifts were exchanged with a poignant sincerity. German tobacco, a luxury for the British, was traded for bars of English chocolate. Homemade biscuits, carefully hoarded from parcels sent from homes in France, were generously shared with German soldiers. Small canteens of potent spirits, remnants of Christmas cheer sent from distant loved ones, were passed around, warming bodies and spirits alike. They showed each other faded, cherished photographs, carried close to their hearts images of wives, of children with innocent, laughing eyes, of aging parents, of sweethearts waiting patiently, anxiously, back home. In those precious, suspended moments, they ceased to be enemies, cogs in a vast war machine. They were simply men, husbands, fathers, sons, united by a common, overwhelming tide of homesickness and a profound love for their families. Uniform buttons, brass and somber, were unfast heart to be swapped as tangible mementos of this unbelievable encounter. Home addresses were hastily scribbled on scraps of paper, often accompanied by a fragile, hopeful promise that after the war, if they survived its insatiable appetite, they would seek each other out, to meet again in peace. Even officers, men conditioned by rank and responsibility, who had initially observed the unfolding scene with a mixture of sternness and cautious apprehension, found themselves gradually, irresistibly, drawn into the extraordinary, amicable atmosphere. They too extended hands, exchanged a few carefully chosen words, acknowledging, with a shared sense of wonder, the unique, almost miraculous nature of this spontaneous cessation of hostilities. One of the most profoundly humane acts of that remarkable night was the spontaneous, collaborative effort by soldiers from both sides to retrieve and bury the bodies of their fallen comrades, men who lay, unclaimed and unmourned, in the frozen desolation of no man's land from recent, brutal engagements. No distinction was made based on the color or cut of a uniform. A brief, solemn, and deeply moving memorial service was conducted right there, in the heart of what had been a killing field. Prayers for the souls of the departed were read in English, in German, and in French, a multilingual litany of grief and respect. The pain of loss, they discovered, was a universal language, felt with equal poignancy regardless of which side of the trench one occupied. As the initial caution and reserve completely melted away, replaced by an atmosphere of almost festive camaraderie, another incredible, iconic scene unfolded. A football, or rather, a battered, deflated leather sphere that passed for one, perhaps a treasured Christmas gift sent from home to some fortunate soldier, materialized as if by magic. And just like that, with an unspoken, mutual consent, an impromptu football match commenced, played out on the churned, muddy, treacherous surface of no man's land. Two greatcoats, hastily discarded, were laid down to serve as makeshift goalposts. Teams were formed spontaneously, sometimes pitting British soldiers against their German counterparts, at other times featuring wonderfully incongruous mixed teams, with men from different, warring nations playing side by side, united by the simple joy of the game. Cheers and unrestrained laughter echoed across the desolate landscape, temporarily banishing the usual, grim symphony of war, the bark of rifles, the roar of cannons, the screams of the wounded. The soldiers, their uniforms already caked in mud, now became even more thoroughly plastered as they chased the ball with a boyish, uninhibited enthusiasm. There were determined, sliding tackles that sent sprays of mud flying, powerful, hopeful shots at the makeshift goals, and inevitable, comical tumbles on the slippery, uneven ground. But after every fall, after every collision, hands were instantly offered in assistance, shared grins far away any hint of animosity, and good-natured, multilingual ribbing filled the air. There was no trace of malice, no bitter rivalry, only the pure, unadulterated joy of the game, a precious, fleeting interlude where they could revert to being young men reveling in sport, not soldiers burdened by the grim, relentless duties of war. The match continued, a chaotic, joyful spectacle, until everyone was thoroughly exhausted, their faces flushed, but their spirits soaring. As the night deepened and the bonfires, kindled with scavenged wood, cast a warm, flickering glow, they gathered around them in companionable circles. They shared the last of their meager rations, the final, precious drops from their canteens. And the singing began anew. This time, it was not confined to solemn carols. Familiar, beloved folk songs from each nation rose into the cold night air, a tapestry of melodies weaving a common thread of shared humanity. German soldiers, with much laughter and pointing, attempted to teach their British counterparts simple German phrases, and the British, in turn, reciprocated with snippets of English. They talked, as best they could with gestures and broken words, about their lives before the cataclysm of war had engulfed them, about their trades, their families, their simple, unfulfilled dreams. Someone produced a harmonica, and its plaintive, melancholic yet strangely hopeful tunes drifted through the encampment, a soundtrack to this improbable piece. An older German soldier, a man with a quiet demeanor and the soul of an artist, silently took out a piece of charcoal and a scrap of paper. With deft, practiced strokes, he began to sketch the scene before him: soldiers from opposing armies, their faces illuminated by the firelight, sitting together in an atmosphere of warmth and profound, unbelievable serenity. The drawing, when completed, was passed around from hand to hand, and all who saw it, regardless of their nationality, recognized the poignant beauty and the deep, unspoken truth captured within its simple lines. But all too soon, this fragile, luminous interlude of peace, this brief suspension of hatred, had to draw to its inevitable close. As the first, faint, chilling notes of bugle calls began to sound in the distance, sharp, cold, and insistent, a stark reminder of the unyielding, impersonal machinery of war, the joyful, convivial atmosphere perceptibly faltered. A heavy silence descended. The orders from high command, relayed down the chain, were unequivocal: they were to return to their trenches. This unofficial, unsanctioned truce would not be allowed to continue. The men looked at each other, their eyes filled with a profound, shared regret, a touch of sorrow, and a gnawing, unspoken apprehension about what the morrow would bring. The laughter died on their lips. They exchanged final, lingering handshakes, these ones imbued with a deeper significance, as if trying to physically hold onto the precious, fleeting moments of connection they had shared. Fragile, whispered promises of not firing first were exchanged, though in the depths of their hearts, everyone understood the grim, unyielding reality of military discipline, the crushing weight of orders that could not be disobeyed. Slowly, reluctantly, the soldiers trudged back to their respective trenches, carrying with them indelible memories that would last a lifetime, small, treasured mementos of an impossible night, and a maelstrom of conflicting, bittersweet emotions. No man's land, once again, reverted to its grim, silent namesake. But this time, the silence it held was subtly, profoundly different. It was imbued with the lingering echo of human connection, the ghost of a Christmas Eve miracle. That night, and for much of the following day, in many sectors along the vast Western Front, the guns remained silent. An uncharacteristic, almost unnerving, quietude settled over the battlefields. But eventually, inevitably, the relentless, grinding cogs of war began to turn once more. Orders were orders, and the soldiers, with heavy hearts, had to once again aim their weapons at men with whom, just the night before, they had shared laughter, songs, and the simple, universal joy of a game of football. The Christmas truce of 1914, though a brief, spontaneous, and largely localized cessation of hostilities, has resonated through the annals of history as a powerful, enduring symbol of shared humanity and the unquenchable, intrinsic desire for peace. It stands as irrefutable proof that even amidst the unparalleled savagery and mind-numbing madness of industrialized warfare, the fundamental decency, the spark of human compassion that resides within individuals, could not be entirely extinguished. The soldiers who participated in the extraordinary events of that night, whatever their ultimate fate in the long, bloody years of war that followed, undoubtedly carried with them, seared into their souls, a memory that could never be erased. They had looked into the face of the enemy, and they had recognized, beneath the alien uniform and the layers of dehumanizing propaganda, a fellow human being, a man with the same fears, the same hopes, the same deep-seated longings as themselves. The melodies of the carols that had bridged the deadly divide, the joyous shouts of the football game that had momentarily transformed a killing field into a playground, the simple, profound warmth of the handshakes exchanged between supposed foes, all these elements wove together to create an unforgettable symphony of humanity. It was a melody that echoed, and continues to echo, across the stark boundary line of life and death, a poignant, enduring reminder that hope, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of our shared human experience can persist, can even flourish, in the very darkest and most desolate of times. And that, perhaps, was the true and enduring miracle of that Christmas night. Story 2. The Reluctant Blade, the story of Alvin York. Alvin Cullum York grew up amidst the rolling, verdant hills of the Pall Mall Valley in Tennessee, a place where life was inextricably linked to the rhythms of the land, to the thrill of the hunt, and to the quiet fellowship of the local church. Alvin's faith was the bedrock of his existence, a deeply held conviction that taught, with unwavering clarity, that man should not kill. He was, by nature and by creed, a man of peace, one who held the pronouncements of the Bible in higher esteem than any earthly decree. Then, the Great War, a conflagration ignited in distant Europe, began to cast its long shadow. At first, its rumblings were like faint, far-off thunder, a disturbance that barely rippled the surface of the tranquil life in the valley. But the currents of history are relentless, and soon America was drawn into the maelstrom. The draft was instituted, a call to arms that reached even into the secluded hollows of Tennessee. Alvin York's name appeared on the rolls. The summons was a seismic shock to Alvin's very being. How could he, a man who lived by the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," possibly take up a rifle, march to a foreign field, and deliberately extinguish the lives of other men? He registered his dissent. He articulated his profound religious objections, penning letters that pleaded for exemption from military service as a conscientious objector. His pleas, however, fell on deaf ears. The military authorities determined that his personal faith, however sincere, did not align with the tenets of a recognized pacifist sect that would grant him such an exemption. Alvin was thus plunged into a crucible of internal conflict, a fierce and agonizing struggle between the deeply ingrained tenets of his faith and the perceived obligations of his citizenship. He prayed long and fervently. He pored over the scriptures, seeking guidance in their ancient verses. He engaged in soul-searching discussions with his pastors, men of God who understood the torment that racked him. In the end, after countless sleepless nights and a wrestling match with his conscience, Alvin arrived at a decision laden with an almost unbearable weight. He would answer the call to serve, but he resolved to do so in a manner that, as best as he could reconcile, aligned with his principles. Perhaps, he thought, he could serve as a medic, a healer of wounds, a preserver of life rather than a taker of it. But destiny, as it so often does, had scripted a different role for him. Upon joining the 82nd Infantry Division, Alvin's extraordinary, almost preternatural, marksmanship, a skill honed to a razor's edge through years of stalking game in the rugged wilderness of his Tennessee home, was quickly and unmistakably recognized. He was, to put it mildly, a prodigy with a rifle. He could strike targets with an accuracy and at distances that left seasoned soldiers speechless. Though his heart remained a battleground of conflicting emotions, Alvin, true to his disciplined nature, excelled in every aspect of his military training. He was a model soldier in his conduct, even as his spirit bore the heavy cloak of his internal disquiet. In May of 1918, the 82nd Division received its orders for deployment to France. Alvin, along with thousands of his comrades, set foot on alien soil, a land saturated with the acrid stench of gunpowder and the pervasive, chilling aroma of death. The war was no longer an abstraction, no longer mere lines of text in a newspaper or tales recounted from afar. It was a visceral, brutal reality that confronted him at every turn. The cannons roared, a ceaseless, deafening symphony of destruction. Men fell, their lives extinguished in an instant. Fear, a cold and insidious companion, and despair, a suffocating blanket, crept into the very marrow of the men. During his initial days on the front lines, Alvin clung steadfastly to his convictions. He made a conscious effort to avoid directly engaging the enemy, to refrain from firing his weapon with lethal intent. He prayed, not just for his own safety or that of his comrades, but for the soldiers on both sides of the conflict, recognizing them all as sons, brothers, and fathers caught in the same infernal machine. But war, with its own grim and inexorable logic, has a way of overriding even the most deeply held personal beliefs. On the fateful day of October 8, 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, one of the largest, most pivotal, and bloodiest engagements fought by American forces in World War I, destiny conspired to place Alvin York in a crucible that would test his faith, his courage, and his very essence to their absolute limits. Alvin's company, part of the larger offensive, was tasked with the perilous objective of capturing a strategically vital German-held position near Hill 223 in the vicinity of Châtel, Chai-Ri, France. The American assault immediately met with ferocious, entrenched resistance. A dense, disorienting fog shrouded the battlefield, reducing visibility and adding to the chaos. German machine gunfire, a relentless, scything hail of lead, tore through the landscape, splintering trees, churning up the earth, and ripping into the advancing American soldiers. Alvin's unit suffered grievous casualties. Officers, one after another, were struck down, either killed outright or grievously wounded. Disarray and confusion threatened to overwhelm the American effort. A small detachment of 17 soldiers, which included Corporal Alvin York, his rank having been elevated due to his competence and the attrition of others, became separated from the main body of their unit. In the fog and confusion, they inadvertently advanced too far, finding themselves deep within the German lines. They stumbled, almost literally, into the teeth of a German machine gun nest, a heavily fortified position that was currently pouring a devastating enfilading fire into the exposed flank of the American advance. If this nest was not silenced, and silenced quickly, the entire American attack in that sector was doomed to fail, and the cost in American lives would be catastrophic. The situation was beyond desperate. It was teetering on the brink of annihilation for Alvin's small group. 6 American soldiers in their detachment were cut down in a brutal fusillade of German machine gun fire. Only Alvin and a handful of others remained, pinned down, vastly outnumbered, and critically outgunned. Escape seemed an impossibility, survival, a fleeting dream. It was in that crucible, that moment suspended between life and death, that a profound transformation, or perhaps an awakening, occurred within Alvin York. Was it the primal instinct for survival, a desperate urge to live? Was it an overwhelming sense of responsibility for his endangered comrades, a refusal to let them perish without a fight? Or was it, as he himself would later humbly recount, something more profound, a divine intervention, a guiding hand in the maelstrom? In that maelstrom, he recalled the words of Scripture, not just, "Thou shalt not kill," but also passages about defending the innocent, about fighting for righteousness when all other avenues were closed. With a sudden, chilling decisiveness that perhaps surprised even himself, Alvin York sprang into action. He issued curt orders to the few remaining men in his group, instructing them to lay down covering fire, to keep the enemy's heads down as best they could. Then, alone, he began to move forward, utilizing every fold in the terrain, every wisp of fog, to conceal his approach as he advanced on the German machine gun stronghold. The German soldiers in the nest, numbering perhaps 30 to 35, were preoccupied with their deadly work, their attention fixed on the main American force to their front. They were utterly unprepared for the silent, lethal threat that was now stalking them from their exposed flank. Alvin, armed with his M1903 Springfield rifle and his .45 caliber Colt M1911 pistol, brought his extraordinary marksmanship to bear. He fired not in panic, but with a calm, methodical precision. Each shot was carefully aimed. Each bullet found its mark. He wasted no ammunition. He focused his fire with chilling efficiency, targeting first the German soldiers who were operating the chattering machine guns. The manner in which Alvin fought, the sheer, ungodly accuracy of his fire, struck terror into the hearts of the German defenders. They had never witnessed such marksmanship, such a one-man storm of destruction. As one German machine gunner fell, another would desperately scramble to take his place, only to be cut down in turn by another of Alvin's unerring shots. Alvin moved with a hunter's instinct, a ghost in the fog, appearing, firing, and disappearing, his shots delivered with a cold, lethal purpose. Seeing their machine guns systematically silenced and their comrades falling around them like leaves in an autumn storm, a German officer, in a desperate bid to neutralize this singular threat, rallied a small group of about 6 soldiers. With bayonets fixed, they launched a furious charge directly at Alvin, hoping to overwhelm him in the brutal intimacy of close quarters combat. This was a moment of supreme, heart-stopping peril. If Alvin hesitated, if his nerve broke for even an instant, he would be overrun and killed. But Alvin York did not hesitate. His mind, sharpened by years of hunting wild turkeys in the Tennessee backwoods, recalled a hunter's tactic: if you shoot the rearmost bird in a charging flock first, and then the next, working your way forward, the lead birds will often break off in confusion. He held his ground, his composure absolute. As the German soldiers, screaming their battle cries, rushed closer, he smoothly transitioned from his rifle to his Colt pistol. With a rapid, almost unbelievable succession of shots, he dispatched them, one by one, starting with the soldier at the rear of the charge and methodically working his way forward until the officer leading the desperate assault fell at his feet. This cool, calculated, and utterly devastating display of marksmanship shattered the morale of any remaining would-be attackers. With the bayonet charge broken and their primary weapons silenced, the remaining German soldiers in the machine gun nest and the immediate vicinity lost all will to resist. They had witnessed, with a mixture of terror and disbelief, the systematic decimation of their comrades by what appeared to be a single, almost supernatural, American soldier. Panic and an overwhelming sense of futility engulfed them. The highest-ranking German officer left standing in that sector, Major Paul J. Rugen-Vollmer, seeing the carnage and recognizing the utter hopelessness of their situation, made the only sane decision. He raised his hands in surrender and issued a guttural command to his remaining men to lay down their weapons. Alvin York, a corporal from the hills of Tennessee, acting largely on his own initiative, had, in a breathtaking display of courage and skill, neutralized an estimated 35 German machine guns, killed at least 25 German soldiers, and single-handedly captured 132 prisoners, including Major Vollmer and several other officers. He and the 7 surviving American soldiers from his original small group then faced the surreal task of escorting this veritable battalion of German prisoners back towards the American lines. When Alvin and his astonishingly large contingent of captives appeared before the American forces who had been pinned down, a wave of stunned disbelief swept through the ranks. They had all but given Alvin and his companions up for dead. Astonishment quickly morphed into unbridled admiration and a profound sense of awe. The extraordinary actions of Alvin York on that foggy October morning were not merely an act of individual heroism. They had a decisive tactical impact. By silencing the German machine gun nest, he had broken a critical strongpoint in the German defensive line, relieving the pressure on the American flank and opening the way for the wider American advance to resume. He had, without a doubt, saved the lives of countless of his comrades. News of Alvin York's incredible feats spread like wildfire through the American Expeditionary Forces and, eventually, back to a stunned and grateful nation. He became an instant, albeit reluctant, hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States' highest military decoration for valor, and was showered with numerous other prestigious medals and commendations from France and other allied nations. Newspapers lionized him. Movie makers clamored to tell his story on the silver screen. But Alvin York, the man, never truly embraced the mantle of hero that was thrust upon him. He returned from the crucible of war with a profound and lasting burden on his soul. He had performed acts that were anathema to his deeply held religious beliefs. He had taken human lives. And though he understood, on an intellectual level, that his actions had been necessary in the brutal calculus of war to protect his comrades, to serve his country, his spirit remained deeply troubled by the violence he had wrought. The profound humility of Alvin York only served to magnify the extraordinary nature of his story. He steadfastly refused numerous lucrative offers to capitalize commercially on his newfound fame. His deepest desire was simple: to return to the quiet, unassuming life he had known in the Pall Mall Valley, to till the soil, to attend his church, and to contribute to the well-being of his community. He channeled the money he received from awards and the influence his fame afforded him into a cause close to his heart: the establishment of a school for the underprivileged children of his impoverished rural region, a place where educational opportunities had previously been a distant dream for many. He believed, with a quiet conviction, that education was the key to a better life, the most potent weapon against ignorance and poverty. Whenever pressed to recount the events of that fateful day in the Argonne forest, Alvin would typically speak with a simple, unadorned honesty. He would say that he had merely done what he had to do, what duty demanded, and that God, in his mercy, had been with him, guiding his hand. He never boasted of his exploits, never reveled in the accolades. Instead, he often spoke with a quiet solemnity about the inherent horrors of war and the paramount importance of peace. The internal torment that Alvin York carried, the spiritual wrestling over the violent acts that war had compelled him to commit, remained with him for the rest of his days. He often sought solace in prayer, seeking forgiveness, seeking peace for his troubled soul. He understood, perhaps more deeply than most, that war was an unmitigated tragedy, and that even those hailed as heroes often bore invisible, lifelong scars. The story of Sergeant Alvin York, therefore, transcends the mere recounting of extraordinary battlefield bravery. It is, at its core, a profound human drama, a story about the enduring conflict between faith and duty, between conscience and command. It is the story of a humble farmer from the mountains of Tennessee, a man of simple origins who was thrust onto the world stage and became an unwilling legend, yet who, through it all, retained his essential humility and a heart that never ceased to question and to care. Alvin York demonstrated, with quiet eloquence, that true courage is not confined to facing down external enemies on a field of battle. It also resides, perhaps even more profoundly, in the courage to confront the internal battles that rage within one's own soul. His lasting legacy is not merely a collection of medals or a chapter in military history. It is a school that educated generations, a community that was uplifted by his efforts, and a poignant, enduring reminder of the terrible price of war and the inestimable value of peace. His blade may have been sharp and true on the battlefield, but his spirit remained forever that of a reluctant warrior, a soul that yearned for reconciliation, for understanding, and for the enduring power of love. Story 3. Echoes of the Heart Letters from the Trenches. The Great War, a maelstrom of iron and fire, tore through Europe, sundering not only nations but also the delicate, intimate fabric of countless individual lives. Millions of men, plucked from the familiar embrace of their homes, from farms and factories, from bustling city streets and quiet village lanes, were thrust into the brutal, alien landscape of the trenches. In this world of mud, barbed wire, and the ever-present shadow of death, one fragile lifeline persisted, a slender, precious thread connecting the grim reality of the front lines to the anxious, waiting world back home, the humble letter. Tens of millions of letters, penned in haste by flickering candlelight in damp dugouts, or with trembling hands in the brief, deceptive lulls between bombardments, made their arduous journey across continents and oceans. And in return, an equal, if not greater, torrent of correspondence flowed back, carrying with it the scent of home, the warmth of familiar handwriting, the whispered anxieties and fervent hopes of loved ones left behind. These were not mere pieces of paper. They were vessels, carrying the very essence of human emotion, a testament to the enduring power of connection in the face of unimaginable adversity. Each envelope, often smudged with trench mud, or creased from being carried close to a soldier's heart, contained a universe of feeling. There was the raw, aching throb of homesickness, a longing for the simple, mundane comforts that now seemed like luxuries from a forgotten era: a warm bed, a home, cooked meal, the sound of children's laughter. Young Private Thomas Baker, a lad barely out of his teens, from a small village in Kent, would write to his mother every week, his boyish scrawl filling pages with descriptions of the French countryside, as much as he could see beyond the parapet, carefully omitting the true horrors that surrounded him. He'd ask about the harvest, about his younger sister's progress at school, about the health of their aging dog Patch. "Don't you worry about me, Mum," he'd invariably conclude, his words a brave, thin shield against the terror that gnawed at him in the long, dark nights. "I'm doing all right, and we'll all be home before you know it. Just you wait and see." His mother, reading his letters by the dim light of a paraffin lamp in their small cottage, would press the paper to her lips, her tears staining the ink, her heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She knew, with a mother's intuition, the fear he was trying so hard to conceal. Then there was the corrosive acid of worry, a constant, gnawing anxiety that permeated letters from both directions. Wives wrote to their husbands, their words a desperate plea for reassurance, for any small sign that their beloved was still safe, still whole. "My dearest James," wrote Eleanor, her penmanship elegant despite the tremor in her hand, "the days are so long without you. Every knock at the door sends my heart into my throat. Please, my love, tell me you are taking care. Tell me you are well. The children ask for you constantly. Little Emily drew a picture of you yesterday, a soldier tall and brave. We pray for your safe return every night." James, a corporal huddled in a trench near Ypres, would read her words over and over, the paper growing soft and worn with handling. He would try to picture Emily's drawing, a brief, warm light in the oppressive gloom. His replies would be carefully crafted, full of bravado he didn't always feel, assuring Eleanor that he was fine, that the war couldn't last much longer, that he dreamed only of the day he would hold her and the children in his arms again. Love, in all its myriad forms, blazed brightly from these pages. Young sweethearts, separated by the cruelties of war, poured out their affections with an intensity heightened by the precariousness of their situation. "My darling Sophie," wrote Lieutenant Michael Ashton, a poet before the war transformed him into an officer, "even here, amidst this desolation, the thought of your smile is a beacon. I carry your photograph in my breast pocket, a talisman against the darkness. The memory of our last dance, of the scent of roses in your hair, sustains me through the longest nights. Know that my love for you is as constant as the northern star, unwavering and true. We shall have our tomorrow, my love, I swear it." Sophie, working as a nurse in a London hospital, tending to the grievously wounded, would read his words with a mixture of joy and a terrible, clutching fear. His poetic soul, she knew, was ill-suited to the brutal realities he faced. But the letters were not solely repositories of sorrow and longing. They also carried fragile, precious sparks of hope, a desperate, human need to believe in a future beyond the mud and blood. Soldiers would write of their dreams for after the war, of returning to their studies, of starting a family, of simply walking in a green field without the fear of shrapnel. "When this is all over, Mary," scribbled Sergeant Bill Wilkins to his fiancée, "the first thing I'm going to do is take you to that little cafe by the sea we always talked about. We'll have tea and scones and watch the waves and forget all about this blasted war." Such dreams, however simple, were vital anchors, preventing men from being entirely consumed by the despair of their present circumstances. The details of daily life, both at the front and on the home front, were meticulously recorded, a way of maintaining a semblance of normalcy, of bridging the vast experiential gulf that separated them. Soldiers described the camaraderie, the gallows humor that helped them endure the unendurable, the small kindnesses exchanged between comrades. They wrote about the surprisingly good stew cookie had managed to conjure from meager rations, or the antics of the trench rat they'd unofficially adopted as a mascot. Back home, families shared news of the village, of rationing and war work, of neighbors' sons also serving at the front. These mundane details were a vital currency of connection, a way of saying, I am still here, you are still part of my world, and I am still part of yours. However, woven through the reassurances and the expressions of love, the stark, unvarnished truth of war occasionally, inevitably, bled through. A hastily scrawled postscript, young Billy from next door was hit yesterday. A bad one, I fear. A subtle change in tone, a wariness that no amount of brave words could entirely conceal. And sometimes, the letters would stop altogether. An envelope, addressed in a familiar hand, would be returned, cruelly stamped with the chilling words I, killed in action, or missing, presumed dead. For the families receiving such news, the world would irrevocably tilt on its axis. The letters, once a source of comfort and connection, would transform into painful relics, tangible reminders of an unbearable, irreplaceable loss. The censors, of course, played their part, their red pens excising any information deemed detrimental to morale or national security. Locations were obscured, details of military operations were redacted, and expressions of extreme despair or dissent were often removed. Yet, despite their efforts, the raw humanity of the writers shone through. The unspoken words, the emotions hinted at between the lines, often spoke more eloquently than the redacted phrases. A soldier might not be able to say where he was or what horrors he had witnessed, but the tremor in his handwriting, the uncharacteristic brevity of his note, could convey a world of suffering to a loved one who knew him well. Reading these letters today, a century removed from the conflict, is a profoundly moving, almost sacred, experience. They are not dry historical documents, they are windows into the souls of ordinary people caught in extraordinary, terrible circumstances. We feel the throb of Private Baker's homesickness, the gnawing anxiety in Eleanor's elegant script, the passionate yearning in Lieutenant Ashton's poetic prose, the simple, heartfelt dreams of Sergeant Wilkins. We see not just faceless soldiers or statistics of war, but individual sons, husbands, fathers, lovers, friends. Through their words, we gain a visceral understanding of the true cost of war, a cost measured not just in lives lost on the battlefield, but in the shattered dreams, the broken hearts, and the enduring grief of those left behind. The letters bear witness to the quiet heroism of endurance, both of the men facing the daily threat of death in the trenches, and of the women, children, and elderly relatives battling their own anxieties and hardships on the home front, their lives irrevocably altered by the absence and the peril of their loved ones. They reveal the incredible resilience of the human spirit, its capacity for love, hope, and connection even in the most dehumanizing of environments. The act of writing, of putting pen to paper, was itself an act of defiance against the chaos and brutality of war, an assertion of individual identity and a refusal to be reduced to a mere cog in the military machine. And the act of receiving a letter, of holding in one's hand a tangible link to a loved one far away, was a moment of profound, often tearful, solace, a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. These, echoes of the heart, these millions of letters that crisscrossed a war-torn world, remain one of the most powerful and intimate legacies of the Great War. They remind us that behind every historical event, behind every grand strategic maneuver, there are individual human stories, individual human hearts, beating with love, with fear, with hope, and with an enduring, unquenchable desire for peace and reunion. They are a somber, eloquent testament to the enduring human need to connect, to share, to remember, and to be remembered, even, and perhaps especially, when facing the abyss. They are, in essence, the quiet, persistent heartbeat of humanity, audible even above the deafening roar of the guns. Story 4. Sergeant Stubby, a hero with 4 paws and a wagging tail. The year was 1917. America was on the precipice of entering the Great War, a maelstrom that had already consumed Europe for 3 agonizing years. On the grounds of Yale University, young men, their minds filled with a mixture of patriotic fervor, youthful idealism, and perhaps a touch of trepidation, were undergoing military training with the 102nd Infantry Regiment, 26th Yankee Division, It was amidst this atmosphere of earnest preparation and impending conflict that a scruffy, brindle-coated stray dog, of uncertain breed but with an undeniable charisma, wandered onto the training field. He had short legs, a broad chest, a tail that seemed to wag with a perpetual optimism, and intelligent, watchful eyes. He was, to put it mildly, a mutt. The soldiers, initially perhaps amused or a little annoyed by this canine interloper, soon found themselves charmed. The dog was friendly, eager for a pat on the head or a shared scrap of food. He would chase after thrown sticks with unbridled enthusiasm and seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense who needed a bit of cheering up. One young private, James Robert Conroy, a man with a gentle heart, took a particular liking to the stray. He began to feed the dog regularly, and soon a bond formed between them. Conroy, in a moment of affection, named him Stubby, a nod to his short, somewhat stumpy tail. Stubby quickly became an unofficial mascot for the 102nd Infantry. He learned to respond to bugle calls, would participate in his own canine way in drills, and even learned to raise his right paw in a semblance of a salute when the soldiers did, much to their delight and the exasperation of some of the stricter officers. His presence was a small, warm comfort, a reminder of the normalcy and affection of the lives they had left behind, a brief respite from the rigors of military discipline. When the time came for the 102nd to ship out to France, a problem arose. Pets were strictly forbidden on troop transports. Conroy, however, was not about to leave his newfound friend behind. With a mixture of ingenuity and daring, he managed to smuggle Stubby aboard the transport ship, hiding him under his greatcoat. For a while, Stubby remained a secret, kept quiet and out of sight. But a dog, even a well-behaved one, cannot remain hidden forever on a crowded ship. Eventually, Stubby was discovered by Conroy's commanding officer. The CO was, understandably, not pleased. As he was lecturing Conroy about the regulations, Stubby, perhaps sensing the gravity of the situation, or simply responding to the officer's raised voice, sat up and, to everyone's astonishment, rendered a perfect little salute with his right paw, a trick Conroy had painstakingly taught him. The stern CO, a man not easily swayed, found himself disarmed by this display of canine discipline and charm. He chuckled, and from that moment on, Stubby was officially allowed to remain with the regiment. He had won his passage to war. France was a world away from the relatively peaceful training grounds of Yale. The front lines were a landscape of mud, barbed wire, constant shelling, and the ever-present threat of death. It was a harsh, brutal environment, one that tested the mettle of even the most seasoned soldiers. Yet, Stubby adapted with remarkable resilience. He seemed to possess an innate understanding of the dangers around him. It was here, amidst the chaos and carnage of trench warfare, that Stubby's true worth, beyond that of a beloved mascot, began to reveal itself. His senses, far keener than those of his human companions, proved to be invaluable. He developed an uncanny ability to hear the whine of incoming artillery shells long before the soldiers could, giving them precious seconds to take cover. He would bark and run frantically, nipping at their heels, urging them to safety. Many men of the 102nd would later credit Stubby with saving their lives on numerous occasions with these timely warnings. But perhaps his most crucial contribution was his ability to detect poison gas. Gas attacks were one of the most terrifying and insidious horrors of World War I. The silent, creeping clouds of chlorine, phosgene, or mustard gas could incapacitate or kill entire units before they even realized they were under attack. Stubby, with his sensitive nose, could smell the gas long before it became concentrated enough for humans to detect. One early morning, while most of the men were asleep in their dugout, a German gas attack was launched. The deadly fumes began to seep silently into the trenches. Stubby, who had been gassed himself once before non-lethal exposure that had made him acutely sensitive to its presence, recognized the danger immediately. He began barking furiously, running up and down the trench, biting and nudging the sleeping soldiers, rousing them from their slumber. His frantic efforts woke the men just in time for them to don their gas masks, saving many from injury or a horrific death. After this incident, Stubby became an indispensable part of the regiment's early warning system. He would patrol the trenches, sniffing the air, a small, furry guardian angel. The soldiers, recognizing his life-saving ability, even fashioned a specially designed gas mask for him, though he often worked without it. relying on his natural senses. Stubby's bravery was not limited to defensive actions. He also proved to be invaluable in locating wounded soldiers in no man's land. After a battle, when the guns fell silent, Stubby would venture out into the desolate, crater-pocked landscape, his keen ears pricked for the faintest groan or cry for help. He would navigate the treacherous terrain, avoiding unexploded shells and tangled barbed wire, until he found a wounded man. He would then stay with the soldier, barking continuously until paramedics arrived. Or, if the man was able-bodied enough, he would gently guide him back towards the American lines. His comforting presence and unwavering determination brought solace and rescue to many a soldier lying injured and alone, facing the prospect of a slow, agonizing death on the battlefield. He could differentiate between American doughboys and German soldiers, and would only assist the Americans. One of Stubby's most legendary exploits, however, was the capture of a German spy. The story goes that one day, while the 102nd was bivouacked in a captured French town, Stubby heard a suspicious noise. He investigated and found a man sketching the Allied trench layouts. The man was speaking German, a language Stubby had learned to associate with the enemy due to the sounds from the opposing trenches. Stubby, recognizing the threat, began to bark and charge at the man. The spy, startled, tried to flee, but Stubby was too quick. He latched onto the seat of the man's pants, holding on with a tenacious grip and barking ferociously until American soldiers arrived on the scene. The spy was apprehended, and valuable intelligence was prevented from falling into enemy hands. For this act of bravery and vigilance, Stubby was promoted to the rank of sergeant by the grateful men of the 102nd Infantry, the only dog to achieve such a rank in the U.S. Army during World War I. Sergeant Stubby served with the 102nd Infantry Regiment for 18 months, participating in 17 major battles and 4 major offensives on the Western Front, including the pivotal battles of Chiteo, Theory, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. He was wounded in action on at least one occasion, struck by shrapnel from a German grenade, which necessitated a period of convalescence in a field hospital. Even there, his cheerful demeanor and comforting presence were said to have boosted the morale of the other wounded soldiers. Throughout his time at the front, Stubby wore a specially made chamois coat, adorned with the numerous medals and wound stripes he earned. This coat became a testament to his service and bravery. He was a familiar, beloved sight to the men of the Yankee Division, a small, scruffy beacon of hope and resilience in a world consumed by darkness. He wasn't just a dog, he was one of them, a fellow soldier who shared their hardships, their dangers, and their occasional moments of levity. When the war finally ended, and the 102nd Infantry prepared to return home, there was no question of leaving Sergeant Stubby behind. He had more than earned his place. He sailed back to America with Private Conroy, now a decorated war hero in his own right. Upon his return to the United States, Sergeant Stubby became a national celebrity. His story, a heartwarming tale of courage, loyalty, and interspecies camaraderie, captured the imagination of a public weary of war and hungry for heroes. Newspapers and magazines featured articles about his exploits. He led parades, met 3 U.S. presidents, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge, and was made a lifetime member of the American Legion and the YMCA. He was awarded a medal from the Humane Education Society, presented to him by General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. Stubby spent the remainder of his life with James Conroy, who went on to study law at Georgetown University. Stubby became the official mascot of Georgetown, attending football games and charming students and faculty alike. He lived a full and celebrated life, a far cry from his humble beginnings as a stray on the streets. Sergeant Stubby passed away peacefully in Conroy's arms in 1926. His obituary in the New York Times ran to half a page, a testament to the impact this little dog had made on a nation. His preserved remains, along with his famous chamois coat covered in medals, are now on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, a lasting tribute to his extraordinary service. The story of Sergeant Stubby is more than just an amusing wartime anecdote. It is a profound illustration of the deep bonds that can form between humans and animals, especially in times of extreme duress. Stubby was not merely a pet, he was a comrade in arms, a protector, a rescuer, and a source of immeasurable comfort and morale. His intelligence, his bravery, and his unwavering loyalty were remarkable. He demonstrated that heroism can come in the most unexpected of packages, and that courage knows no species. In the grim, dehumanizing landscape of World War I, where men were often reduced to mere numbers, where death was a constant companion, Stubby represented something pure, something good. He was a reminder of the simple virtues of loyalty, courage, and devotion. He didn't understand the politics of the war, the reasons for the conflict, but he understood friendship, he understood danger, and he understood the need to protect those he cared for. His ability to warn of gas attacks and artillery bombardments undoubtedly saved human lives. His skill in locating the wounded brought comfort to the dying and rescue to those who might otherwise have perished. His capture of a German spy was an act of vigilance that had tangible military value. But perhaps his greatest contribution was intangible: the boost in morale, the moments of affection, the simple, uncomplicated joy his presence brought to men living under unimaginable stress and facing the constant threat of annihilation. He was a furry, four-legged antidote to despair. Sergeant Stubby's tale continues to inspire and touch hearts. He stands as a unique and beloved figure in the annals of military history, a testament to the extraordinary capabilities and unwavering spirit of a little stray dog who became a true American hero. His legacy is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, acts of courage, loyalty, and love can shine through, and that sometimes the greatest heroes walk on four paws. Story 5. A Farewell to Innocence, Hemingway, Agnes, and the Echoes of War. The summer of 1918 burned with a feverish intensity, not just from the Italian sun, but from the relentless, grinding crucible of the Great War. Into this inferno of conflict stepped a young, ambitious, and undeniably charismatic American, not yet 19 years old, by the name of Ernest Hemingway. He had arrived in Italy not as a combatant soldier. A recurring leg injury from his school days had initially disqualified him from active service, but as a volunteer ambulance driver for the American Red Cross, he was eager for adventure, for experience, for the raw, visceral taste of life that he believed could only be found on the fringes of danger. He sought stories, and in Italy, amidst the chaos and carnage, he would find them in abundance, along with something far more personal and transformative, a love that would both scar and inspire him for the rest of his days. Stationed near the Piave River front, Hemingway threw himself into his duties with a characteristic, almost reckless, bravado. He ferried wounded soldiers from the treacherous front lines, navigating shell-pocked roads under the constant threat of artillery fire. He witnessed firsthand the horrific human cost of war: the shattered bodies, the haunted eyes, the pervasive stench of blood and antiseptic. It was a brutal, unsparing education, stripping away any romantic notions of glory he might have harbored. Then, on the night of July 8, 1918, near Fasalta di Piave, Hemingway's own brush with mortality arrived with a devastating suddenness. An Austrian mortar shell exploded nearby, riddling his legs with shrapnel. Despite his own grievous injuries, and in an act of remarkable courage that would later earn him the Italian Silver Medal of Military Valor, he managed to help carry another wounded Italian soldier to safety before collapsing. He was evacuated to the American Red Cross Hospital in Milan, a sprawling institution filled with the broken bodies and weary souls of the war. It was here, amidst the sterile scent of carbolic acid and the hushed sounds of suffering, that his life would take another, unexpected turn. His nurse, assigned to tend to his multiple, painful leg wounds, was Agnes von Kurowski. Agnes was an American, 7 years Hemingway's senior, a professional nurse with the Red Cross. She was attractive, intelligent, and possessed a calm, capable demeanor that soothed the anxieties of her patients. She was also, in the eyes of the young, impressionable Hemingway, an ethereal figure of compassion and grace. He was immediately, deeply, and utterly smitten. His recovery was long and arduous. Confined to his hospital bed for months, with dozens of pieces of shrapnel still embedded in his legs, Hemingway found solace and a burgeoning romantic obsession in Agnes's presence. He called her Vaughn, or Aggie. He showered her with attention, wrote her boyish, passionate notes, and regaled her with stories, already honing the narrative skills that would later define him. He was a charming, if sometimes overly intense patient. Agnes, for her part, was initially a professional caregiver, She was accustomed to the affections of wounded soldiers, men far from home, vulnerable and in need of comfort. She treated Hemingway with kindness and efficiency. But there was an undeniable spark between them, a connection that transcended the usual nurse-patient dynamic. Hemingway's youthful ardor, his raw vitality even in his injured state, and his burgeoning literary talent were undeniably appealing. Agnes, too, was far from home, surrounded by the grim realities of war, and perhaps she found a welcome distraction, a flicker of romance, in the attentions of this charismatic young American. Their relationship blossomed within the confines of the Milan hospital. There were stolen moments, whispered conversations in the quiet hours of the night, shared jokes, and a growing emotional intimacy. For Hemingway, this was not just a flirtation, it was the grand passion of his young life. He envisioned a future with Agnes, a life filled with love and adventure once the war was over. He wrote to his family back in Oak Park, Illinois, effusively praising Agnes, hinting at marriage. Agnes's feelings, however, were perhaps more complex, more guarded. She was older, more experienced in the ways of the world and the heart. While undoubtedly fond of Hemingway, and perhaps even in love with him to a degree, she may have viewed their wartime romance with a greater sense of realism. Aware of the age difference and the uncertainties that lay ahead, the intense, almost claustrophobic atmosphere of the hospital, with its constant reminders of mortality, could easily foster intense, fleeting connections. As Hemingway slowly began to recover, able to move around on crutches, their relationship continued. They had outings in Milan, precious moments of normalcy amidst the abnormality of war. But the war itself was an ever-present, unyielding third party in their romance. The news from the front, the constant influx of new casualties, the pervading sense of loss, all these cast a long shadow. When Hemingway was deemed well enough to leave the hospital in January 1919, he returned to the United States, his heart full of love for Agnes and his mind brimming with plans for their future together. He believed, with the certainty of youth, that she would soon follow him, that they would marry and build a life. They corresponded regularly, their letters crossing the Atlantic, carrying protestations of love and longing. But distance, time, and perhaps the harsh light of post-war reality began to take their toll. Agnes remained in Italy, continuing her nursing duties. She was surrounded by other men, other officers, men closer to her own age and experience. The intensity of the hospital romance, forged in a crucible of shared danger and vulnerability, began to cool, at least on her side. In March 1919, Hemingway received a letter from Agnes that would shatter his world. It was a "Dear John" letter, though the term had not yet been coined. Agnes wrote that she was very fond of him, but that she had realized she was more like a mother to him than a lover. She also revealed that she had become engaged to an Italian officer, Domenico Caracciolo. She wished Hemingway well, but the message was clear: their romance was over. The news devastated Hemingway. It was a brutal, public humiliation, as he saw it, having boasted of their impending marriage to his family and friends, and a profound emotional wound. He felt betrayed, his youthful idealism and romantic illusions shattered. The pain of this rejection would linger, a deep scar that would inform much of his later life and, crucially, his literary work. He threw himself into writing, channeling his anguish and disillusionment into his stories. The experience with Agnes, the intense love affair, the wartime backdrop, the ultimate heartbreak, all these became fertile, if painful, ground for his burgeoning literary genius. The most direct and enduring literary fruit of this wartime romance was, of course, his celebrated novel, A Farewell to Arms. Published in 1929, the novel tells the story of Frederick Henry, an American ambulance driver serving in the Italian army during World War I, and his passionate, tragic love affair with Catherine Barclay, an English nurse. The parallels to Hemingway's own experiences with Agnes are undeniable, though transformed and fictionalized through the prism of art. In A Farewell to Arms, Hemingway explores themes of love and loss, war and disillusionment, courage and despair. The character of Catherine Barclay, while not a direct portrait of Agnes, certainly embodies some of her qualities: her compassion, her strength, her role as a caregiver in a world torn apart by conflict. The intense, all-consuming love between Frederick and Catherine, played out against the brutal backdrop of the war, mirrors the passion Hemingway felt for Agnes. And the novel's ultimately tragic ending, the sense of inevitable loss, powerfully reflects the heartbreak Hemingway himself experienced. A Farewell to Arms is not simply an autobiographical retelling, it is a profound meditation on the nature of love in a world where death is omnipresent, where innocence is a casualty, and where even the deepest human connections are fragile and vulnerable to the impersonal, destructive forces of war. The novel's spare, understated prose, a hallmark of Hemingway's mature style, perfectly captures the emotional desolation and the quiet heroism of its characters. The relationship with Agnes von Kurowski, though relatively brief and ultimately ending in heartbreak, was a pivotal, formative experience in Ernest Hemingway's life. It provided him with his first profound experience of love and his first devastating experience of loss. It thrust him into the raw, unvarnished reality of war, stripping away romantic illusions and forcing him to confront the brutal truths of human existence. Agnes, for her part, went on to marry the Italian officer, though that marriage, and a subsequent one, eventually ended in divorce. She continued her nursing career for many years. While she rarely spoke publicly about her relationship with Hemingway, she acknowledged its impact and perhaps, in later years, viewed it with a certain nostalgic fondness, tinged with the understanding of youthful intensity. The letters they exchanged, particularly those from Hemingway, reveal a young man deeply in love, idealistic, and vulnerable. Agnes's letters, fewer in number and perhaps more circumspect, nonetheless show a woman touched by his affection, grappling with her own emotions in a challenging time. The legacy of their wartime romance endures, not just as a poignant chapter in the biography of a great American writer, but as a powerful reminder of the ways in which personal experience, particularly experiences of love and war, can fuel the creative imagination. The pain of that farewell to Agnes, so keenly felt by the young Hemingway, was transmuted into art, into a novel that continues to resonate with readers around the world, a timeless exploration of love's resilience and its tragic fragility in the face of war's relentless devastation. It was a farewell to Agnes, certainly, but in a larger, more profound sense, it was also a farewell to a certain kind of innocence, an innocence irrevocably lost amidst the mud, blood, and heartbreak of the Italian front. The echoes of that wartime love, and its painful conclusion, would reverberate through Hemingway's life and work, shaping the man and the artist he was to become. Story 6. The unarmed brave echoes from the Red Cross. In the cacophony of the Great War, where the primary instruments were those of destruction, the shriek of shells, the chatter of machine guns, the roar of cannons, there existed another, quieter, yet profoundly resonant sound. It was the hurried footfall of stretcher bearers, the urgent murmur of a medic assessing a wound, the whispered words of comfort offered to a fallen soldier. These were the sounds of the unarmed brave, the men and women of the medical corps, who ventured into the very heart of hell not to take life, but to preserve it. They came from all nations embroiled in the conflict, British Tommies with their Royal Army Medical Corps insignia, French poilus serving as brancardiers, German Saniteur with their distinctive Red Cross armbands, and American doughboys from the U.S. Army Medical Department, among countless others from every corner of the globe. Often, they carried no weapons, their only shield the internationally recognized emblem of the Red Cross, or Red Crescent, a symbol that, in the brutal calculus of total war, was tragically, frequently ignored. Yet, armed only with medical bags, stretchers, and an unyielding commitment to their calling, they advanced into the maelstrom. Their battlefield was not one of conquest, but of compassion. While infantrymen charged forward to seize ground, the medics and stretcher bearers followed in their wake, or sometimes even preceded them into the most perilous zones, their mission singular: to reach the wounded, to staunch the bleeding, to offer what solace and aid they could amidst the carnage. They navigated landscapes torn asunder by artillery, littered with the dead and dying, a nightmarish terrain of mud, barbed wire, and unexploded ordnance. Each step was a gamble with death. Consider the experience of a young stretcher bearer, perhaps a former shop assistant from Manchester or a farmhand from Bavaria, his identity lost to the anonymity of the masses, but his courage representative of thousands. He and his partner, their faces grim with determination, would inch their way across no man's land under a hail of shrapnel and sniper fire. Their objective a faint cry, a barely perceptible movement amidst the shattered earth. Reaching a fallen soldier, they would work with a desperate, practiced haste, their hands, often slick with mud and blood, gently assessing injuries, applying field dressings, perhaps administering a precious shot of morphine to dull the unimaginable pain. The journey back, carrying the dead weight of an unconscious or grievously wounded man on a heavy canvas stretcher, was an agonizing test of endurance. Each yard gained a victory against the odds, all while bullets whizzed past their ears and shells exploded perilously close. The field dressing stations, often little more than hastily dug shelters or ruined farmhouses just behind the front lines, were scenes of organized chaos and desperate hope. Here, medics, orderlies, and surgeons worked tirelessly, often for days on end with little or no sleep, surrounded by the overwhelming sights, sounds, and smells of human suffering. They triaged the wounded, making agonizing decisions about who could be saved, who needed immediate, life-altering surgery, and who, tragically, was beyond their help. They battled against infection, a relentless killer in the pre-antibiotic era, with little more than basic antiseptics and their own skill. They performed amputations in primitive conditions, a grim necessity to save a life. The rasp of the bone saw a sound that would haunt their dreams. The dedication of these medical personnel often transcended national loyalties. While their primary duty was to their own fallen comrades, countless accounts exist of medics from one side rendering aid to a wounded enemy soldier. In those moments, stripped bare of uniforms and ideologies, there was only the shared humanity of suffering and the universal imperative to alleviate pain. A German medic might offer water to a wounded British Tommy. An American ambulance driver might risk his life to transport a captured, bleeding Austrian to a field hospital. These acts of compassion, often performed at great personal risk, were small, flickering candles of humanity in the overwhelming darkness of war. They were a testament to the core principles of the Geneva Conventions, a fragile assertion that even in the midst of total conflict, some rules, some decencies should still apply. The ambulance drivers, like the young Ernest Hemingway before his injury, played a crucial role in this chain of mercy. They navigated treacherous, shell-cratered roads, often under direct fire, their vehicles frequently targeted despite the red crosses painted on their sides. Their cargo was precious wounded men, their lives hanging by a thread, desperate to reach the relative safety and more advanced care of a base hospital further from the front. Each journey was a race against time, a perilous dash through a landscape designed for death. The jarring ride, the constant threat of explosion, the moans of the injured packed tightly within, these were the daily realities of their service. Nurses, too, both those serving in field hospitals near the front and those in the larger base hospitals further back, were pillars of strength and compassion. Women like Agnes von Kurowski, and countless others whose names are not so widely remembered, worked under immense pressure, facing an unending stream of horrific injuries. They cleaned wounds, changed dressings, administered medications, and, perhaps just as importantly, offered words of comfort, a gentle touch, a listening ear. They were witnesses to unimaginable suffering, yet they maintained their professionalism and their humanity, providing a semblance of order and care in a world consumed by chaos. They wrote letters home for men too weak to hold a pen, read to those whose eyes were bandaged, and sat with the dying, offering a last human connection in their final moments. The psychological toll on these medical personnel was immense. They were constantly exposed to the most gruesome aspects of warfare. They saw bodies torn apart, minds shattered by shell shock, young lives extinguished with brutal finality. They carried the weight of the lives they couldn't save, the faces of the men who died in their care. Many suffered from what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by the images, sounds, and smells of the front. Yet, day after day, they returned to their duties, driven by a profound sense of purpose, by a commitment to their comrades, and by an unwavering belief in the sanctity of human life. Their bravery was not always the flamboyant, medal-winning courage of the battlefield charge, though many medics received high honors for acts of valor under fire. Often, it was a quieter, more sustained form of courage, the courage to keep going in the face of overwhelming odds, the courage to confront horrific sights day after day, the courage to maintain compassion in a world that seemed to have abandoned it. It was the courage of the heart as much as the courage of the will. The letters written by these medics and nurses, and by the soldiers they treated, often speak of their quiet heroism. A soldier might write home about the brave sawbones who patched him up under fire, or the nurse whose gentle hands made the pain a little more bearable. The medics themselves, in their own correspondence, might describe the exhaustion, the frustration, the overwhelming sadness, but also, occasionally, the profound satisfaction of a life saved, of a small victory against the tide of death. The legacy of these unarmed brave is not always found in grand monuments or stirring anthems. It is found in the lives they saved, in the families that were not shattered by loss because of their intervention. It is found in the enduring principles of humanitarian aid that they upheld, often at great personal cost. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the midst of the most brutal conflicts, the human impulse to heal, to care, and to show compassion can endure. They were the stretcher bearers stumbling through mud and wire, the surgeons operating by lantern light, the nurses soothing fevered brows, the ambulance drivers racing against death. They were the often unsung heroes of the Great War, their contributions immeasurable, their sacrifices profound. Their actions transcended the bitter divisions of nationality and allegiance, speaking to a higher, shared humanity. They demonstrated that even when nations were locked in a deadly embrace, the individual could still choose compassion over cruelty, healing over destruction. The red cross they wore was not just an emblem, it was a declaration that life was precious, that suffering demanded alleviation, and that the bonds of our common humanity were stronger, ultimately, than the forces that sought to tear us apart. Their courage was not the courage to kill, but the infinitely more profound courage to save, and in their quiet, determined efforts, they illuminated the darkest corners of the war with the unwavering light of the human spirit. Their echoes still resonate, a testament to the enduring power of empathy in a world too often defined by conflict.